Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. It is such a joy to see you this morning. We are recording here in the Rabbi Samuel Chill Sanctuary. Today is Thursday, January 2nd, and it's just the two of us, but so excited to think together about what is such an important topic for us in this new year and in every new year. There was a fascinating article that was published in the Times back in July. It was a story of trauma, of a kidnapping that happened 50 years ago, and the way that that kidnapping has reverberated in the family for years. The way that it inspired the author to think about her own experience of childbirth. But that wasn't the story. Taffy Brodesser-Akner, as part of her review of 2024, wrote an article titled, "I published a story about trauma. I heard about everyone else's." She wrote about how when she published her original story, people from all over wrote her all different kinds of stories of their own experiences of trauma. And when she shared this with her friend, who's a trauma therapist, her friend said, "I think this speaks to narrative theory and practice. The idea that being human is being storied. Our identities are built on the stories told about us, and that we tell about ourselves and experiences. And healing comes from restoring our self-narratives, and importantly, also from sharing them. We need our stories to be witnessed in order to heal." So today we're going to be talking about the importance of telling our stories, not just what happened, but in creating the kind of narratives that can help us to find meaning and ultimately healing. So let's start with our Torah blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzaenu v'tze'etzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai, hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. So I want to start off by looking first at this explanation of narrative theory and practice. So Wes, I want to invite you, if you could just read, we're in the article, Applications of Narrative Theory and Therapy to the Practice of Family Medicine. And if you could just read this first paragraph.
Of course. Narrative therapy is a form of psychotherapy pioneered in Australia and in New Zealand in the 1980s that emphasizes the importance of story and language in the development and expression of interpersonal and intrapersonal problems. It uses therapeutic questioning to help clients recognize and reflect on the discrepant but positive elements of their current problem-saturated stories and to empower them to reformulate a more preferred life direction.
So I want to just ask you if you've seen this in action and where you've seen this in action.
Elise, I think this is such a profound point. I love this point and I love this class. I just think it is so profound and so repercussive as Jews, as Americans, as humans. Here's what I read this to be saying, which is what's important is not only what happened to us. What happened to us, the facts, the raw facts are important. But what is at least as important is the story we tell about what happened to us and whether we can reformulate that story in a way that it inclines towards future conduct that is going to be redemptive. In other words, one way to look at Israelite history is we were slaves for 430 years and their lives were bitter. Think about how many innocent people were born as slaves and lived as slaves and died as slaves. Slave, 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 death, 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 the story. But that's not what we do. What we say is it's the whole arc. We went from slavery to freedom, from darkness to light, from subjugation to redemption. And why do we do that? So that we could go from being slaves to Pharaoh to being slaves to God, to being an avadim to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, which would result in us being more compassionate than ever. So it takes the raw fact of the fact of our slavery, and it reformulates it into a whole story, which we call Pesach, right? And this whole Seder is about how do we move that story from darkness to light, and how can that inspire conduct that adds to the light. I just think it's so powerful.
I'm so glad. I was so excited to see this this concept, this therapeutic concept in this article. For me, it also brought up another layer, which is it's not just important to create another narrative layer, right? It's not important just to, it is obviously super important. You have to be able to take your story and understand it in a forward-thinking way, but you also have to tell your story. And that's something that's, I think, so beautiful about the story of the Israelites, is it's not just that we created this story once upon a time, but we have an active practice of every morning reciting that story so that we're actively doing that work every single day.
And then it shapes who you are as a person. You become a storyteller where you're and built into that is resilience. And built into that is not just that you are a storyteller that is a resilient story, but you are a storyteller actor that is where resilient action is built into that. And if you think about it, and therefore it transforms us, and it's a generational thing. You think about, this is just so profound, Elisa, this is just so important. Think about the 3 Yoms that come up in the spring. You have Yom HaShoah. What could be more, no more words need be said. I'll say I went to see A Real Pain, the movie with Jesse Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin. I've never been to the camps, but you go into they take you to Auschwitz, and you see the crematoria, which is stained with a blue paint on the walls, because that was a poisonous residue from the gas. And in the movie, there's like total silence. Like, what can you say in the face of ultimate evil and ultimate death, and how many innocent, etc.? And that's Yom HaShoah. And then a week later, we have Yom HaZikaron and all the fallen soldiers, and how that is no longer only about 1948 and 1956 and 1967 and 1973 and the Lebanon War, etc., but is very much about October 7th and the aftermath. And how many fresh families have fresh victims of who have fallen. Just Har Herzl was just sobbing and shrieking and so sad. And yet you go from the Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron in a day to Yom HaAtzmaut, and there's a moment of silence, and then an insistence on celebration. That is a story that we tell of resilience, which leads to an action of resilience in the biblical story, in Judaism, in terms of the Seder, in modern Israel.
It's so important. And I think there's also real important work to be done. But like, when can you do that work? At what point are you able to set up those stories, those communal stories, either for biblical Israel or for modern day Israel? When in our own lives are we able to transmit trauma into narrative potential for our futures? And how do we function as a community to support one another?
Yeah, so I think obviously it takes time. We have to let time do its time. You can't do it, you can't comfort the bereaved when their dead lies before them. That's what Pirkei Avot says. That the art of life is timing. But I think with time and perspective, then part of the healing is formulating a different story. I'm wondering, do you see that in play? Not only the ability to tell a different story, which is to acknowledge the pain and not eliding it or ignoring it or denying it. You acknowledge it, but you then build from it. Do you see that in the Joseph story by any chance? And talk about how time factors into that.
I do, and I want to get into the Joseph story, but before we do, there's a trend that I just want to lift up in our popular world, and this is something that I see on social media platforms all the time. And I know you hang out on Instagram all the time, but on Instagram, or if you're on
You're being,
Facebook,
of course, facetious, because I don't even know. I know that Instagram is something that young people do. I've never been on it. Yes,
but there's an interesting, and I think this is like a generational thing that feels important. There's a trend to post these very sad videos of people that just sort of like bare their souls and open up their trauma and list it out into the world, and just video after video of people who are just sharing without this narrative shift, without a move towards what is positive. And I think that's a reaction to a generational trend, which was not to share your trauma and not to tell your story. And there was so much challenge of survivors who wouldn't ever talk about their stories and wouldn't ever want to impose their trauma. They held it all in and kept it to themselves so as not to hurt anybody else. And so now there's a reaction.
Which itself hurts people.
Right. So now there's this big reaction to just tell all and reveal all and be just open with trauma. Neither one of those is a totally healthy response.
Right.
So I want to think about sort of what's the communal role before we go into Joseph, because Joseph's story is not just about Joseph and Joseph's own story of trauma and how he reinterprets it. And it's not just the brother story, and they also have a story to tell. And it's not just the Egyptian story, it's also the story of how communities help each other with their narratives and with reshaping their narratives. And I think for us, particularly as we start off in 2025, I want to be thinking about, okay, I have a role to do. I have work to do for myself, reinterpreting my own trauma. Like, I can use this personally, but then I also have a role to listen to other people's trauma and to reinterpret other people's trauma, or to help them sort of reframe what they might be thinking. And maybe there's also a role, that we can play in the world at large in a bigger way, to be thinking about what are the national stories, what are the global stories that we can be telling that can shift our experience. So let's turn to Joseph.
Okay.
And this is chapter 50 of Genesis. It's actually next week's Parsha. And I want to just look in this. There's sort of three groups that I want to focus on as we're reading this story. This is happening right after Jacob has assembled all of his sons to give his final blessing. It's this very beautiful, the moment that we have created our vidui ritual when people are leaving the world, to give them the opportunity to bless their family and to receive blessings and words of love. He does this. He's able to consciously and thoughtfully with every member of his family. He says, this is where I want to be buried. Here are my wishes for my funeral. And then we pick up here at Genesis 50. So if you want to read the story, and we'll just go through this narrative of what happens after Jacob dies.
Sure. Joseph flung himself upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph ordered the physicians in his service to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. The Egyptians bewailed him 70 days. And when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. Be sure to bury me in the grave which I made ready for myself in the land of Canaan. Now therefore let me go up and bury my father, then I shall return. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father as he made you promise on oath. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the officials of Pharaoh, the senior members of his court, and all of Egypt's dignitaries, together with all of Joseph's household, his brothers and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the region of Goshen. Just footnote, grandkids did not bury Jacob, right? So there's something about a generational disconnect, that the Egyptian-born grandchildren, whether it was they didn't have the heart, they didn't have the feeling, they didn't have the connection, they didn't say, what do you mean? Of course I'm going to go and bury Saba in Israel. They didn't have it, right? I just know that.
And while we're pausing here, I also just find it so fascinating. Grandchildren aren't mentioned.
No, they are mentioned as not going.
Right. But they're not mentioned as going. But Egyptians wailed 70 days.
Yes.
And what is that story about? Like, who are these Egyptians that are crying out their eyes? Did they know Jacob? Like, was this about their own experience of loss? Was it about Joseph? Like, what's happening here? This is something that I just find, like, do you have a read on this? Where are the Egyptians? Like, what's their grief coming from?
Right. And also, it also struck me, it's a good question. The question is much better than any answer I have, especially because I have no answer. And I would also say, I think that the Egyptians' view towards Joseph must have been layered and complicated and very ambivalent. Because yes, he kept them alive. That's a good thing. They didn't die of hunger. And if you ever read, Nothing to Envy about North Korea's hunger in the 90s, dying of hunger is brutal. So he saved them from that, but he enslaved them. The first slaves in Egypt were Egyptians, and it was Joseph who did that. And so the fact that Joseph's father, the guy who sired the person who would enslave us and also save us, but enslave us and save us, That does not translate to 70 days of mourning. I don't quite get it.
And also, the fascinating thing for me that, yeah, there's practical purposes for embalming his father, but I have so many questions for Joseph. Like, is that what your dad laid out for you? Was that his vision, was to be embalmed like Egyptians and then brought to Canaan?
Right.
Like, did he have a picture of what that was practically going to look like?
Right. And when you think about, traditional Jewish values abhor embalming, and in Israel you're buried on the day of. I mean, you're buried on the day of, and in Israel people are buried at night so that a day doesn't pass literally. In America, it's a day or two. If somebody's out of town, you'll wait 2 days, but it was certainly within a day or two. Here, 70 days embalming. It just speaks to the complexity of culture and life, etc.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I also want to just highlight the relationship between Joseph and Pharaoh. There's this fascinating thing where all of the Egyptians are bewailing and all the Egyptians are mourning. Pharaoh's not there, presumably.
Right.
But then Joseph goes to him and is like, hey, I made this deal with my dad. My dad is really important to him. And Pharaoh's going to say, okay, like, I support that, but Pharaoh is not going. There's this very interesting disconnect between
Right.
official Egypt and unofficial Egypt, the official chariots and the unofficial, like,
Yeah. Well, Andy Stanley, in his podcast with Arthur Brooks talks about real friends and deal friends. Deal friends are just professional acquaintances, and it sounds like Pharaoh and Joseph are deal friends, not real friends.
So let's keep going.
Okay, chariots too and horsemen went up with him. It was a very large troop. When they came to Goren Or, the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they held there a very great and solemn lamentation. He observed a mourning period of 7 days for his father. And when the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at Goren Atad, they said, "This is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians." That is why it was named Avel Mitzrayim, interpreted as the mourning of the Egyptians, which is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had instructed them. His sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, the field near Mamre, which Abraham had bought for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Now, did you want to talk about the Midrash, or should I keep going?
Let's keep going, because I want to go through and read where are the brothers in this, because I think this, as we were reading this, in this moment, what came up for me was very much the story of Jacob and Esau, when Esau arrives with all the armies, and Jacob's fear that there's armies with him.
Right.
As I was rereading this, I was wondering, what's the brothers' narrative? Like, what are they thinking when Joseph amasses all of these Egyptian officials and chariots and officers and everybody's coming? Like, are they thinking like, wow, they really loved our dad? Or are they thinking like, oh no, Joseph has planned. He's getting us back. He's finally getting us back.
Right.
And the whole way that they're going with all these people and all these chariots, I wonder if they were just freaking out the whole journey back.
Right. And their narrative might have been, we screwed our brother, we threw him into a pit, we sold him into slavery, somehow he survived, damn, and our father kept us alive. Now our father is dead. Now he's going to whack us. We are walking dead. Might be their narrative.
Totally.
When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did him?" So they sent this message to Joseph. Before his death, your father left this instruction. So shall you say to Joseph, "Forgive me, I urge you, the offense and guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. Therefore, please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father's house." And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him. His brothers went to him themselves, flung themselves before him, and said, "We are prepared to be your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. And so fear not, I will sustain you and your dependents." Thus he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So Joseph and his father's household remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years.
So we have a really powerful narrative reinterpretation of history just in the Pshat, which Joseph says, even though you intended me harm, this was God's plan. This was out of your hands. He takes the responsibility out of his brother's hands and really interprets this as a divine plan to create healing.
Right. But to your point earlier, before we got into the text, it takes time to come up with a re-story, a new story, a better story, a trajectory story that arcs into the future. Because Joseph was something like 17 when they threw him into the pit and sold him into slavery. He was something like 30 when he becomes, number 2 to Pharaoh. This is close to the end of his life, so it's many decades later. So he now has time to say, yeah, you threw me in the pit, and yeah, you intended this for harm. But as a result of that, that's not the story I'm telling. The story I'm telling is because that happened, I was able to come up with this plan to sustain us during the famine. It saved the lives of so many Egyptians, and in fact, it saved the lives of our own family too.
And
it must have been God's plan.
Must have been God's plan. But one thing that I wonder about, we don't hear him reflecting on his narrative trajectory in this moment. This is the first time I think we hear him telling somebody else, like, here is my whole life story was for this purpose. And it happens in the context of speaking with his brothers. It happens in the context of revisiting his narrative. And so it's this role of, he's going back. What are they talking about on the way to see the dad? What are they talking about? They're reflecting about this moment. They're sharing stories. They're sharing memories, maybe. And in that context, he's able to do this work.
Right. Yeah. And as a result of that, by the way, what that leads to, it's not just a different story or a re-story, to use the language of the therapist that you brought, but it's a re-story that leans forward into better conduct, because it goes on to say, and so fear not, I will sustain you and your children. Thus he reassures them, speaking kindly to them. In other words, number one, he doesn't kill them, which he would have had the power to do. And so he doesn't kill them. He speaks kindly to them. And most importantly, they continue to live in Goshen, and they are sustained. So it's a re-story that has resilient implications.
The other thing that's interesting to me about this for the brothers is that the episode with Jacob was not the most kind final words, let's just say, right? Jacob does not give blessings to every brother. Some of them he gives actual curses. His last words to some of his children are really mean.
Jacob's, yes.
Jacob's last words.
Yes.
And in this, they also create a re-story, which is that our dad visioned for us that we would be able to all reconnect, that we would be able to have a big, happy family, that we would be able to put the past behind us and move forward in positive light. And they're able to articulate that to Joseph, and he in turn responds to their re-narrative in a powerful way. So it's this fascinating moment where their ability to encounter trauma together, to share that story again, gives them a perspective, a new perspective, that enables a more positive future.
Yeah. I'll tell you what comes up for me when I read this material and have this conversation is a conversation that Andy Stanley had with John Maxwell, who's this leadership guru. And John Maxwell says that a question he asks when he, coaches people, and he's a very big coach, is, what is the greatest life lesson you ever learned? And John Maxwell says that the greatest life lesson that I ever learned always comes from a place of failure and setback. That, years ago I got fired, or years ago I made a dumb mistake and broke up my marriage, or years ago I made a dumb mistake and exploded a relationship, or years ago I committed a crime, or years ago I acted very irresponsibly, or years ago a horrible thing happened and my life exploded. And then the re-story. And then I learned that. And I learned, I learned, and I developed new character I didn't even know that I had, etc. And so what's so powerful about this whole idea of re-story is that it always flows from adversity. From, you don't have to re-story a success. Like, I graduated number 1 in my class, and I had straight A's, and I got 1,600 on my SATs, and every dream that I ever had was fulfilled, and my re-story is. No, that you never get a re-story from successes. Re-stories, by definition, flow from my brothers betrayed me, I got sold into slavery, my marriage exploded, my business failed. and I got a divorce or whatever happened. So there was some brokenness, and now a restory, and as a result of the brokenness to the restory, a new set of conduct.
And that's, I think, so important because I think the restory narratives are what we so desperately need in our world today. There are so many stories of trauma, and obviously we need to tell those stories because telling our stories of trauma is what enables us to get to the restory of narrative potential. But what we desperately need are to hear of stories where people said, I was in a really dark place and I did XYZ and it turned out to be amazing. And I actually got a much better start on life because of that trauma that reshaped my life, and now I'm in a better place.
Aliza, could you connect all of this really evocative material, super important material, to the trauma of the Jewish people since October 7th?
Yeah, I think that the trauma of October 7th is a little close to be applying the re-narrative.
We don't have
potential.
enough time yet.
I don't think we do. I think that there's some narrative that's happening in Israel around, Israel today is more secure than it's ever been because of October 7th. They've been able to dismantle Hezbollah and Hamas, and because they're in a more secure position.
We're safer now than we were on October 6th. I mean, the latest podcast from Daniel and Yossi was we're safer now than we were on October 6th.
But to me, that doesn't fully speak to the trauma of October 7th, and it doesn't fully speak to all the losses that are still unfolding, and to it's still very uncertain. It's still very precarious. It's still very dangerous. It's still very worrying. So I feel like we're not quite there yet. And I have this question of what's the narrative? What's the process by which? Part of the process is telling our stories in the documentaries that are coming out and the narratives that are coming out. And I think part of the challenge to our communal healing has been a world stage which is unable and unwilling to hear about our trauma, to hear our story of trauma, and to witness that trauma. It sort of holds us in a place where we can't go to the re-narrative stage because we're just desperate to be seen in our trauma. But I think that time will give us that space to be able to get to a place. Do you have a sense of
well, I have the sense that this thing about the importance of bearing witness. When a group of 50 folks from the shul went to Israel in February, a very big part, maybe the driving part of that trip, we also painted some walls, and we also weeded some gardens, and we also did some service, and we also flipped some burgers for hungry soldiers. But that wasn't the driver. The driver was hearing the stories of. We met with so many survivors, and they told their stories, and they would tell those stories to JNF group after JNF group, to Americans after Americans that would come because of the importance of bearing witness to a story. And I think that, and I think you're right. So much of the world doesn't see, doesn't care, doesn't know. But when you bear witness to a story, the story happened.
I want to connect this to this time of year because I think in our country right now, there's a real process of active work that's happening. At the end of a year, all the newspapers are focused on what happened in 2024 and who are the notable people that passed away and what are the notable events and what have we lived through communally. And I think the missing piece of that is what's the narrative story that we're going to tell about that. I think that's happening for us as a country. It's happening for us as a world. And I think it's happening for us personally. And I want to focus in on that because we have some active work that we can do. I want to turn to the midrash that Midrash Tanchuma that talks about Joseph going back, literally going back to the place of the pit, going back to the place where his brothers threw him in. And he recites a blessing. And I have a question of if we as a people can develop Joseph's blessing into a practice, into a personal spiritual practice of revisiting. Maybe you had moments in 2024 that were really terrible. Maybe you had moments that were really traumatizing. Maybe you had moments that were challenging, or maybe not just this year, but in previous years. Can we use this practice to bring a lens of Joseph in to help us to create another narrative, another layer of meaning? So let's turn to the Midrash Tanchuma.
Vayechi 17:5.
Yes, please.
And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, etc., what did they see that frightened them? In other words, why did they come up with this big lie? Why did they send the email saying, Dear Joseph, our father said?
Yes.
Right. As they were returning from the burial of their father, They saw their brother go to the pit into which they had hurled him in order to bless it. He blessed the pit with the benediction. Blessed be the place where he performed a miracle for me. Just as any man is required to pronounce a blessing at the place where a miracle had been performed in his behalf. When they beheld this, they cried out, "Now that our father is dead, Joseph will hate us and will fully requite us for all the evil which we did unto him." And therefore they sent a message into him, saying, "Joseph thy father did command, yada, 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 so shall you say to Joseph," etc. We have searched the entire scripture and are unable to find any place where Jacob uttered this remark. This statement is introduced to teach us the importance of peace. The Holy One, blessed be he, wrote these words in the Torah for the sake of peace alone.
I love this class. The rabbis are like, just so you know,
It
the
didn't
moral of
happen.
the story. Peace is the most important. But that blessing, Baruch HaMakom she'asali nes b'makom hazeh, blessed is Hamakom, which is God the place, or God who is space, or God who is time, or God who is, and who did a miracle for me right here.
Right.
And so I wonder about, like, what is that? You know, is it a fake it till you make it? Can you go back and just say this to yourself again and again until it feels real? Is this something where you actually have to revisit that pit every single time and tell that story again and again and again until you get to the place where you can see the pivot point? What's the spiritual practice that we can take to do this work of metabolizing our own trauma?
Yeah, to me, I think the lesson of it is, and there's there's this Mishnah in Brachot that we are supposed to bless God for the bad as well as for the good. It feels connected to that, and I think it invites us to look at the hardest parts of our life. Look at the hardest parts of our life and see points of connection. See what good might have flowed. And nobody would have ever picked this, right? And it's not saying that that if we could pick something off a menu, I would pick off the menu getting thrown into a pit and sold into slavery by my brothers. There is no menu and there is no picking. It's saying this happened to me, and how can I look at this and restory it? Again, now there was time, right? He wasn't doing this fresh from it. He was doing this decades later. How can I look at this with the healing power of time and connect it to something that's positive and beautiful and uplifting? You know, Elisa, one of the things that I learned, especially from you, all last year was miserable in 1,000 ways trying to do teaching after October 7th because, it was just such a hard year and to talk about it was to be in a down place. And after every class we did, these Talmud classes, there was always a critique that you would offer about uplift. Is there any uplift? Where's the uplift? And you were 100% right. And I was just in a very dark place, and I very often couldn't summon that uplift. But I always had your voice ringing in my head. Where's the uplift? Because we are hardwired for uplift too. And I think that this midrash about Joseph blessing the pit is saying we are hardwired for uplift. How can we take a look at this and find in it uplift? And then how can we build from that life's greatest lesson? When you think about, our best move as a people, it is because we were slaves unto Pharaoh in Egypt, therefore have more compassion and more solicitude for people who are on the margins. That's just so beautiful. That's what you want to spend your life doing, being part of that religious tradition, and everything about it, like the restoring that goes into it, the ability to process pain that goes into it, the ability to be resilient comes from that, the ability to tell the story and to continue to tell the story and to do it not only every Pesach but every day, etc. It teaches us how to roll through life because pain is a part of it. Therefore, being able to restore that pain into an uplifting future is just really important.
Amen, amen. So it's the beginning of 2025. This is our year for new stories. We have the power to go back and reflect on what has happened objectively and restory it so that it tells a story of power and potential so that we too can get to the place where we can say, Baruch HaMakom she'asali nes b'makom hazeh. Wow, blessed are you, God, who did a miracle for me in this very dark place.
Amen. Thank you. Amen.